At 8:03 in the morning on January 24th, 2006, Jennifer Kesse's co-workers at Westgate Resorts in Orlando, Florida, logged her absence. She hadn't called in. She hadn't responded to a single text. For a woman described by everyone who knew her as relentlessly responsible, the kind of person who confirmed plans twice, who kept a calendar color-coded by priority, who never missed a deadline in 3 years at the same company, this was already wrong before anyone had words for it. By noon, her boyfriend Rob Allen had driven north from Fort Lauderdale, 90 miles up the Florida Turnpike, to her apartment in the Mosaic at Millennia Complex in southwest Orlando. The door was unlocked. Her car was gone. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her cell phone sat beside it, screen dark. Her work bag was positioned near the front door exactly the way it always was when she was about to leave for the office, and in the refrigerator, on the second shelf, sat a plastic container with the lunch she had packed the night before, untouched, still cold. Jennifer Kesse was 24 years old. She had been missing for less than 12 hours. It would take investigators 3 days to find her car, 4 months to develop a single lead worth chasing, and nearly 2 decades to arrive at a name. A name that, even now, has never produced an arrest, has never produced a trial, and has never produced an answer to the question the Kesse family has been asking since that Tuesday morning in January: where is she? To understand how we got here, you need to go back to January 23rd, the last night anyone can place Jennifer Kesse alive. Jennifer Kesse was not a missing person statistic waiting to happen. That framing matters, because the cases that fall through the cracks are often the ones where it's easiest to construct a narrative around a mistake the victim made, a wrong turn, a bad decision, a moment of trust extended to the wrong person. With Jennifer, none of those easy explanations fit from the beginning. That clean inexplicability was part of what made the disappearance so difficult to explain and so difficult to let go. She grew up in Bradenton on Florida's Gulf Coast, about 60 miles south of Tampa. The kind of upbringing that produces a specific kind of steadiness. 2 parents who stayed married, Drew and Joyce, a younger brother named Logan, Saturday morning youth soccer, homework finished before the television went on. She graduated from the University of Central Florida in 2003 with a degree in finance. Not drifting, not directionless. She knew what the degree was for, and she used it. By the time she was 24 years old, she had worked her way up to finance director at Westgate Resorts, one of the largest vacation ownership companies in the United States, headquartered right there in Orlando, tens of thousands of employees. She had her own apartment in a complex that wasn't cheap. She had a 2-year relationship with a man she trusted. She had a plan that extended several years into the future. The Mosaic at Millennia sat in the southwestern quadrant of Orlando, just off Millennia Boulevard, a stretch of commercial development that had exploded in the late 90s, alongside the broader Central Florida population surge. Strip malls and chain restaurants gave way to newer residential complexes, the kind built to attract young professionals who wanted proximity to the interstate and the commercial corridor without the expense of downtown. Not a dangerous area, not isolated. The complex itself was gated, a detail the Kesse family would mention repeatedly in the weeks and months after Jennifer vanished, because it was supposed to mean something. Gated entry, surveillance cameras at multiple points, a managed property with a staffed leasing office. A place where a young woman living alone was supposed to be, by the calculation of rent and infrastructure, reasonably safe. Jennifer had just returned from St. Croix. She and Rob Allen had taken a long weekend trip there. Warm water, the particular blue of the Caribbean in January, a break from work. She flew back to Orlando on Sunday evening, January 22nd. She was tan. She had photographs on her camera. She called her parents that night, the way she always did when she got back from somewhere, to let them know she was home. She called them again the following evening, Monday the 23rd. 2 calls in 2 days, both warm, both unremarkable, both a daughter checking in with her parents the way she had done consistently for years. The call on the evening of January 23rd ended the normal way. Good night, talk soon, love you. It was the last time Drew and Joyce Kesse heard their daughter's voice. After the call, Jennifer moved through the ordinary routines of a Monday evening at home. Neighbors in the adjacent units later told investigators they heard movement inside apartment 2603 at various points through the evening. One neighbor placed the sounds at around 10 p.m. Another reported hearing the hum of the air conditioning unit cycling on. These were the sounds of a person doing ordinary things, putting away laundry, making lunch for the next day, preparing for an early morning. The sounds of someone planning to be somewhere the following day. Investigators would later establish, from phone records and building access logs, that Jennifer was inside her apartment throughout the evening of January 23rd. She made no calls after the one to her parents. She did not leave the building. At some point between those evening sounds and 7 o'clock the following morning, something interrupted the ordinary trajectory of her Tuesday. Rob Allen called her at approximately 7 a.m. on January 24th. The phone rang and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He sent text messages and watched the delivery receipts sit unread. He described the quality of that silence later in interviews. Not the normal silence of a missed call or a busy morning, but a different kind. The kind that registers in the gut before the mind has caught up with it. By mid-morning, he was in his car, heading north on the turnpike. He was at the Mosaic at Millennia before noon. The door to Unit 2603 was unlocked but pulled shut. He pushed it open into a space that looked exactly the way Jennifer's apartment always looked, clean, organized, everything in its place. Her jewelry sat on the dresser, including pieces she wore regularly. Her wallet was on the counter beside her cell phone. Her work bag was positioned near the door, angled outward, the way she always left it when she was about to head to the office. In the kitchen, the plastic container on the refrigerator shelf held the lunch she had assembled the night before, a detail that landed with specific weight, because packing lunch the night before was exactly the kind of thing Jennifer Kesse did. It was preparation. It was planning. It was the behavior of someone who intended to be at her desk at Westgate Resorts the following morning. Rob Allen called the Orlando Police Department. They took the missing persons report, and then the investigation that would define the next 2 decades of the Kesse family's life formally began. The first 72 hours of any missing persons investigation carry a specific weight that experienced detectives understand before the coffee on their first morning is cold. Evidence has a half-life. Surveillance footage from commercial properties in 2006 lived on hard drives running rolling overwrites, typically on 48 to 72-hour cycles, and those clocks were already running before Jennifer's co-workers logged her absence at 8:03. Witnesses remember things on day 1 that they can't reconstruct on day 4. The apartment was processed. Investigators interviewed Rob Allen in detail, checking his account against the phone records and the turnpike toll logs. They spoke to neighbors. They contacted Jennifer's colleagues at Westgate, building a timeline of her last confirmed days. What emerged from that initial sweep was a portrait of total order, interrupted only by absence. Nothing inside apartment 2603 had been disturbed in a way that suggested a struggle. No broken furniture, no overturned objects, no blood, no physical evidence of violence within the unit. The apartment looked the way it would look if Jennifer had stepped out for a moment and was about to return. Except she wasn't returning. The most concrete anomaly in those first hours was the car. Jennifer's 2004 Chevrolet Malibu, silver Florida license plate B776AG, was not in its assigned spot at the Mosaic at Millennia. The car was gone. Every other indicator pointed to a woman who had no intention of going anywhere that morning without her phone, her wallet, and her lunch. But the car was gone. That gap between a person who appeared to have been preparing to leave for work in the normal way and a person who was not there became the center of the investigation. On January 26th, 2 days after Rob Allen's call to police, the Malibu was found. It was parked in the lot of the Huntington on the Green condominium complex, roughly a mile south of the Mosaic at Millennia, on what was then called Mosaic Boulevard. The car sat in a row of spaces used by residents of that complex. It had been there long enough that several residents had noticed it didn't belong. Not a car they recognized, parked in a spot that wasn't assigned to any unit they knew of. It wasn't hidden. It was just parked carefully, the way you'd park a car if you intended to leave it there for a few days, without drawing immediate attention. The exterior showed no collision damage. The interior showed no signs of the kind of violence that would have answered some questions while opening others. The car had simply been driven from the Mosaic and left at Huntington on the Green by someone who then walked away from it. The processing of the Malibu yielded fingerprints that did not belong to Jennifer Kesse, Rob Allen, or any of her identified associates, and it yielded something else, something that would become the most examined, most analyzed, most publicly circulated piece of evidence the investigation would ever produce. The parking lot at Huntington on the Green had security cameras, analog cameras feeding into a system that by the timing of the recovery had not yet completed its overwrite cycle. Detectives pulled the footage. They reviewed it frame by frame on a monitor in an evidence room somewhere in the Orlando Police Building on Huey Avenue. And there, at a timestamp, reading approximately 9:57 a.m. on the morning of January 24th, roughly 2 hours after Jennifer's co-workers marked her absent, roughly 3 hours after the window when she would typically have left for work, was a figure walking away from Jennifer Kesse's silver Malibu. The figure moved through the parking lot and then toward a gap in the fence line that ran along the southern boundary of the complex. The cameras captured the movement from multiple angles as the figure passed through the frame. The image quality was the standard of 2006 commercial surveillance, low resolution, compressed, the Florida morning light washing out detail in the background, but enough was visible to establish parameters. The figure appeared to be male, medium build, not particularly tall or short, dark pants, a light-colored shirt. The gait was unhurried, deliberate, someone who knew where they were going and was not running from anything. The face was obscured. A fence that ran along the lot sat at the precise height in the geometry of that specific camera angle to block the figure's features across every frame in which a clear identification would otherwise have been possible. It was the kind of detail that investigators and crime analysts would discuss for years afterward. Whether it was calculated, whether the figure knew the camera placement and used the fence deliberately, or whether it was simply the specific, terrible luck of a surveillance system encountering a person at exactly the wrong intersection of height and hardware. The face was never visible. In 16 years of technological enhancement, of digital reconstruction, of forensic gait analysis applied to every frame, the face remained a gap. That image became the public face of the Jennifer Kesse investigation. Not a crime scene photograph, not a piece of physical evidence, a grainy still frame from a parking lot camera, a silhouette that had walked away from a missing woman's car and then walked out of the frame and, apparently, out of the reach of every investigative tool available for the better part of 2 decades. By February of 2006, the investigation had expanded into parallel tracks that would occasionally intersect and often frustrate each other. Orlando police maintained the primary active case, working through the evidence with their own detectives and analysts. The Kesse family had hired private investigators within weeks of Jennifer's disappearance, a decision born not from distrust of the department, but from the recognition that the resources of a family with means, applied in coordination with professional investigators who answered only to them, might find angles that a department managing dozens of active cases could not fully pursue. And the national media had arrived, drawn by the photograph of a young professional woman with a clear face and an inexplicable absence, drawn by the surveillance image and the suspect who seemed to have been almost captured on camera, drawn by the Kesse family's willingness and ability to stay visible. America's Most Wanted featured the case in its first month. The segment aired to an estimated audience of several million viewers and generated hundreds of tips that were logged and worked through. Local Orlando stations, WESH, WFTV, WKMG, ran the story with regularity through the spring and into the summer of 2006. Drew and Joyce Kesse became, by necessity, public figures. They appeared in front of cameras in the particular posture of parents who have decided that the only power available to them is visibility. That as long as their daughter's face and their family's names were in front of people, the possibility of a tip, a recognition, a moment of conscience in someone who knew something remained alive. They flew to Orlando from Bradenton, and then they moved to Orlando. They rented space near the investigation. They held press conferences. They met repeatedly with investigators, in formal briefings, and in the informal settings where the real information sometimes moved more freely. And they built Change for Jennifer, an advocacy organization that would spend the following years doing 2 things simultaneously: keeping Jennifer's specific case in public view and working to change the structural conditions that allowed cases like hers to fall through gaps in the system. The primary investigative lead in those first months centered on the mosaic at Millennia itself, specifically on the construction renovation work that had been ongoing at the complex in the weeks and months before Jennifer's disappearance. Multiple contracting crews had been working on the property. Some workers had been temporarily housed in vacant units within the complex, a common arrangement on large renovation projects where the workforce needed proximity to an extended job site. This meant that the gated community Jennifer lived in had, in the period directly preceding her disappearance, an additional population of men whose backgrounds had not been comprehensively vetted by the property management company, who had knowledge of the property's layout and access points, and who had had extended opportunity to observe the routines of residents. Investigators subpoenaed employment records from the contracting companies. They ran names against criminal databases. They conducted interviews, some cooperative, some not, with workers who had been on the site. The fingerprints recovered from the Malibu were run against every available database. This was meticulous, slow, unglamorous investigative work, and it produced almost nothing that made it into public reporting for months. Then, in the spring of 2006, something shifted. Investigators identified a person of interest with a connection to the construction work at the Mosaic. Details about this individual were tightly held. Orlando police did not release the name publicly, did not hold a press conference announcing the development, and provided only the most general confirmation that an individual was being looked at. The person was interviewed. They were not charged. As the months wore on, the public references to this person of interest became less frequent and then stopped. The investigation continued, publicly described as active, but the person of interest who had briefly organized the inquiry seemed to have been ruled out or set aside, and the case settled back into the particular silence of an unsolved investigation with no viable suspect. That cycle, the surfacing of a lead, the period of apparent progress, the return to silence, would repeat multiple times over the following decade and a half. Each iteration left the Kesse family in the same position, managing hope, carefully enough that it didn't become the thing that broke them. The years between 2007 and 2015 had a specific texture to them. The case never went fully cold in the bureaucratic sense. Orlando police kept the file active, kept a detective with primary responsibility for it. But the pace of development slowed to the rhythm of a case where the available investigative tools had been substantially exhausted and new tools had not yet arrived. Tips came in from the public at a rate of dozens per month in the early years, tapering to something smaller by the middle of the decade. Each one was logged. Most were worked through to a dead end within days or weeks. The surveillance image was re-enhanced multiple times as digital processing technology improved. In the years immediately after 2006, investigators worked with the best tools then available for cleaning and sharpening low-resolution footage. As the technology advanced, the image was run through increasingly sophisticated processing algorithms. Forensic artists produced composite sketches of what the figure's face might look like, working from the body proportions visible in the footage, from the gait pattern, from the angle of the shoulders, and the set of the neck above the fence line that blocked everything useful. The composites were published. Tips came in. None of them produced a viable identification. In 2009, a psychic contacted the Kesse family with specific claims about Jennifer's location. This was not unusual. High-profile cold cases attract this consistently, with enough frequency that investigators develop standard handling protocols for it, but the family, operating with the particular openness of people who have exhausted conventional avenues, gave it a careful hearing. Nothing actionable came from it. In 2011, road construction and utility work in the southwest Orlando area near the Mosaic generated a brief period of heightened attention, with media coverage suggesting that excavation work might produce remains. Nothing was found. What the family built during this period was something more durable than any single lead. Change for Jennifer moved from a grief response into a functioning advocacy organization with a specific legislative agenda. Drew Kesse and his wife worked the Florida legislature with the focused attention of people who had learned, from 18 months of direct experience, exactly which structural failures in the missing person system had cost their family the most. The work they did produced what became informally known as the Kesse Law, legislation requiring Florida law enforcement agencies to initiate missing persons investigations immediately upon report without the traditional waiting period of 24 to 48 hours that had historically been applied to adult disappearances on the assumption of voluntary absence. The law changed the framework for how agencies responded in the critical early hours of cases like Jennifer's. It was a real and measurable change. It has almost certainly helped other families avoid the specific hours-lost grief that the Kesses had lived through. It was not what the family built it to be. In 2017, 11 years after Jennifer vanished, Orlando police released a newly enhanced version of the surveillance footage and the still image extracted from it. The announcement was accompanied by a public request. Investigators were asking anyone who recognized the build, the walk, the specific way this figure moved through a parking lot on a January morning to come forward. The release generated significant national media coverage. The 11-year anniversary, the new technology, the persistence of a case that refused to close. Hundreds of tips flooded the tip line in the first weeks. Investigators worked through them over the following months. None of them produced a name. The turn came in 2022. It came without a press conference in advance. It came through a method that had been quietly rewriting cold case investigation across the country for 4 years by that point. A technique that had given detectives something they had never reliably had before: the ability to work backward from biological evidence to a family, and from a family to a name. Investigative genetic genealogy had broken open the Golden State Killer case in 2018, when California investigators used DNA from crime scenes committed decades earlier, run against consumer genealogy databases where distant relatives had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to build a family tree and ultimately arrive at Joseph James DeAngelo. The technique spread rapidly. By 2021, it had been used to identify suspects or close cases in dozens of investigations across multiple states. Cold cases that had been sitting in evidence rooms for 30 or 40 years were suddenly producing names. In Jennifer's case, investigators had the fingerprints recovered from the Malibu, prints that had been sitting in the evidence system since January 26, 2006, running against every available fingerprint database on a periodic basis and producing nothing. But the processing of the Malibu had also yielded biological material. Trace material preserved in the evidence storage system of the Orlando Police Department for 16 years. Material that, with the right methodology, contained genetic information. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement worked the genealogical analysis in coordination with Orlando Police, beginning the process at some point in 2021 or early 2022. The methodology required constructing family trees from DNA matches in consumer databases, GED match, family tree, DNA, or similar platforms, where individuals had submitted samples for genealogical research. From a distant match, investigators built outward and then narrowed, eliminating branches that didn't fit the geographic parameters, the age parameters, the physical parameters suggested by the surveillance footage. The person they were looking for had to have been in Orlando in January 2006, had to have had a connection to the mosaic at Millennia or the surrounding area, had to be consistent with the build and movement visible in the parking lot footage. That process, running through months of genealogical tree construction and elimination, produced a name, Jorge Morales. Morales had worked as a laborer on a construction crew contracted to perform renovation work at the mosaic at Millennia in the period immediately preceding Jennifer Kesse's disappearance. He was in his 30s at the time. He had been living and working in the United States. By the time Orlando police arrived at his name through the genealogical work, he had been deported from the United States and was residing in Guatemala. In October 2022, Orlando police held a press conference. They named Jorge Morales publicly as a suspect in Jennifer Kesse's disappearance. They released a photograph of Morales alongside the 16-year-old surveillance still from the Huntington on the Green parking lot. Investigators stated their belief that the figure captured on camera at 9:57 a.m. on January 24, 2006, walking away from Jennifer's Malibu, was Jorge Morales. The physical comparison in the side-by-side images, the build, the proportions, the angle of the shoulders, was, by the investigators' account, consistent with the DNA genealogical work. The family was informed before the announcement was made public. Drew Kesse stood in front of cameras again, 18 years after he had first done so, and said that having a name was meaningful and that a name was not enough. Both things were true at the same time, and the distance between them was the entire measure of what the case had come to. Orlando police coordinated with the FBI on the extradition request. Guatemalan authorities were contacted through the appropriate bilateral channels. Morales was located in Guatemala. He was questioned by Guatemalan authorities. He denied involvement in Jennifer Kesse's disappearance. He was not extradited. Guatemalan law contains a provision, common to a number of countries in the region, prohibiting the extradition of its own nationals. This is a legal framework that exists independently of any individual case, a constitutional protection in Guatemalan law that applies to Guatemalan citizens regardless of what they are accused of in a foreign jurisdiction. To extradite Jorge Morales to the United States would require either a change in Guatemalan law, a bilateral treaty provision that overrides the national protection, or a change in circumstances, Morales entering a jurisdiction that operates under different extradition rules that no one currently controls. American officials have pursued every available legal avenue. The Kesse family's legal representatives have worked the process. As of the most recent public reporting, at the time of this recording, Jorge Morales has not been charged in the United States, has not been extradited, and has not been tried. What the public identification produced, beyond the immediate media surge, was a retrospective reorganization of everything the investigation had accumulated. Investigators revisited the construction crew records from 2006 with a name to anchor the search. Workers from that period who had not previously been interviewed or who had been interviewed briefly and moved on were contacted again. The original fingerprint evidence and the biological material from the Malibu were re-examined in light of the identification. The case file, thousands of pages, covering 16 years of tips, leads, interviews, and dead ends, was worked through again with new organizing context. The Kesse family received all of this and continued to do what they have done since February 2006. Stay visible, stay organized, stay in communication with investigators, and refused to allow Jennifer's case to settle into the administrative quiet of an unsolved file. Change for Jennifer continued to operate. Drew Kesse continued to give interviews. The family continued to mark anniversaries, to hold press events, to do the specific work of keeping a name in front of the public when public attention is the only leverage available. There is something worth naming directly about the architecture of this case, something that investigators and legal analysts and family advocates have returned to repeatedly over the years. Jennifer Kesse did not make an identifiable mistake. She cannot be situated within any framework of recklessness or misplaced trust that would make her disappearance explicable through the lens of what she could have done differently. She lived in a gated community with surveillance cameras. She was cautious and consistent. She called her parents. She maintained a structured, observable life. If someone entered her space in the final hours of January 23rd or the early hours of January 24th, 2006, they got there through access, the specific access that months of construction work on the property had created, knowledge of the layout, familiarity with the routine of the building, understanding of when and how residents moved through the complex. If the investigation's current conclusion is correct, this was not random. It was proximity made systematic over weeks or months of shared space. The surveillance image persisted as the defining artifact of the case for 16 years because of a specific and terrible quality it possessed. It showed a human being who could not be named. Not a composite sketch, not a description, but an actual person, caught by actual cameras, at what investigators believed was the moment directly after Jennifer Kesse's disappearance, walking away from her car, moving through an ordinary parking lot, face hidden by the specific intersection of a fence post and a low-resolution lens. That unnaming quality is what made it haunt every coverage of the case, what made people send the image to contacts and post it in forums and study it with the particular urgency of a puzzle where the answer is theoretically visible but practically out of reach. Jennifer Kesse would be 43 years old today. The Malibu has been processed and reprocessed. The surveillance still has been enhanced, past the point where technology can do more with it. The genealogical work has produced a name. The name has not produced an arrest. A fence in a parking lot, and a camera angle, and 16 years, and a constitutional provision in Guatemalan law. That is the distance between where the case is and where the Kesse family needs it to be. The evidence is preserved. The case is listed active. Every few months, a new tip arrives and is worked. Drew and Joyce Kesse have spent more than 18 years in the specific posture of parents waiting for a resolution that has not come. Not passive waiting, but organized, public, legislative, relentless waiting. The kind that requires you to keep speaking about your daughter in the present tense while managing full knowledge that the present tense may no longer apply. The kind that produces law changes and advocacy organizations and press conferences and a family that has given more of their remaining years to this than anyone could reasonably ask. None of that is the outcome they were working toward. None of it is what they would have chosen. They were built for Jennifer to come home. She has not come home. If this case stayed with you, the kind that doesn't let go after the screen goes dark, there's another one on this channel that investigators circled for nearly as long, with evidence that eventually led somewhere no one expected. It's there when you're ready.